Hi, welcome everyone, I'm Kramer, and at the end of this video you'll be an expert at the useEffect hook. useEffect is a React hook that allows you to tell React it needs to do something after rendering. We pass a function which is called our effect to the useEffect hook, which will tell React to run our function on every render. The hook takes two parameters. The first parameter of the hook is a function that defines what should happen. By default, this function is called every time the component renders or re-renders, unless specified by the dependency array. This array gives us the ability to control when our function runs. This works by telling React to skip running the function if the values in the array have not changed between renders. There are three ways to use the dependency array. 1. If you don't provide an array, the function will run after every render. 2. An empty array means the function will only run once after the first render. 3. An array with values means the effect will run after the first render and every time the component re-renders, if one of the values in the array has changed from the previous render. And it's also important to note that each of these cases will run at least once after the initial render. So in this example, we have three different useEffect hooks that demonstrate the three different ways to use the dependency array. The first useEffect hook doesn't have a dependency array, so it runs after every render and logs a message to the console. The second useEffect hook has an empty dependency array, so this means it will run only once after the first initial render. The third useEffect hook has an array that includes the count state variable as the dependency. This means it runs after the first render and every time the count state variable changes from the previous render, which will also log a message with the value of the count. We also have a piece of state called active, and this is just to demonstrate that the third useEffect hook only runs after the dependency of count changes. So I've just started the app and we can see that after the initial render that all three useEffect hooks ran. If I trigger a re-render by increasing count, we can notice that the first and third effect is called, but not the second. The first one runs on every render, and the third runs because the dependency count value has changed since the previous render. And we can see this every time I increment count. Now I'll click the active button, and we can notice that only the first useEffect hook ran. This is because there was a re-render, but the count value did not change from the previous render, so the third effect hook is not triggered. So notice the second array only ran once after the initial render. We can also think of the empty array dependency as the same as an array of values. React compares all the values of the array with the values of the previous render to determine whether or not to call the effect. Since it is always an empty array, the values during the comparison are always the same, and so the effect is only called on the initial render. So here's an example that does an API call. Here we have a movie search app where we can search for movies by title, year, and genre, or a combination of these values. The dependency array comes in handy here by providing the title, genre, and year as a dependency. We can tell React to only call the API when one of these values changes, avoiding any unnecessary API calls. So I can, for example, search Shrek. This will trigger the effect since the value in our dependency array has changed. Our effect will then call the API with the search term Shrek, retrieve the movie data, and update the state of our app with that data. If I then sort the movies by year, this causes a re-render, but it is not triggering another API call. As the sort value is not part of our dependency array, the effect is skipped. It saves us an unneeded API call. Having multiple items in the dependency array is common, and it's worth to note React will run the effect even if just one of the items in the array has changed. From our previous example, our dependency array had title, genre, and year. Whenever any one of these variables changed, the effect function was triggered and our movie's results updated. React's documentation recommends that you include all state and props that you use in your effect into the dependency array. This is because including all relevant values in the array helps prevent issues where your code references outdated values from previous renders, which could lead to unexpected bugs or errors. In our previous example, if we forgot to include the search value in the dependency array, when the search value is changed, our function won't be triggered, resulting in outdated search results from previous renders. By including search in the dependency array, we ensure that this function is always ran when the search value updates. This keeps our behavior in sync with the state. If you're ever unsure about what dependencies you need to include, you can use the React Hooks exclusive depth lint rule as a helpful tool to identify any missing dependencies in your code. For instance, in our movie search example, if we have ESLint turned on and we remove title as a dependency, we'll receive an error warning us of the missing dependency. Overall, this is a pretty useful tool to have when you're unsure about which dependencies you need to include. It's important to know that when you add all your state variables as dependencies, you may encounter certain situations where this could cause an infinite loop. In this small example, the useEffect hook is used to set an interval when the component is first rendered. This interval is run every second and increases the count for each second that passes. Since we are accessing the count state, and by following the previous mentioned rule, we need to add count to our dependency array. But we have an issue. Since count in our dependency array will cause an infinite loop. Since count is in the dependency array, the effect is re-triggered each second because the count value has changed from the previous render. This constant re-triggering creates new intervals, which is not what we want. To solve this issue, we can use the functional update form of the setup function to update the count state based on the previous value. By doing this, we can remove count from the dependency array safely. With the functional update, instead of directly passing a new value to the state setter, we provide a function that takes the previous state value as an argument and returns the new state value. This allows us to compute the new state based on the previous state. Applying this to our interval example, instead of directly accessing the count state, we use a function that takes the previous value and adds 1 to it. This allows us to safely remove the count dependency as we are no longer referring to count in our effect, avoiding the infinite loop problem. Notice in the previous example we have a return function inside our useEffect hook. This is the useEffect cleanup function. This function is triggered when the component unmounts, providing us with the opportunity to do any required cleanup such as clearing intervals, cancelling subscriptions, or disposing of any unnecessary resources that the effect may have created. In the example, we use the cleanup function to clear the interval when the component is unmounted. This ensures that our interval is no longer running when the component doesn't exist, which would be a waste of resources. When working with functions and the useEffect hook in React Native, it's important to be mindful of what state and props the function being called is accessing. Here the print count function is accessing the count state. Again, following from the previous rule, we should always place all props and states that the function uses into the dependency array, or our useEffect hook may not function correctly. However, in large examples with multiple effects and functions, it can be easy to lose track of what dependencies belong to which useEffect. To address this, React's documentation recommends declaring functions needed only by an effect inside of it, making it easier to see what values the effect depends on. For example, here we've moved the print count function inside the useEffect. This makes it clear what states or props the effect depends on, ensuring that your dependency array is correct. There can be times where it's not practical to move the function inside the effect. For example, what if you have two effects that use the same function? Another option is to move the function outside of the component's render. We can do this as long as any state or props it's accessing are passed as parameters. This allows the function to be used anywhere and is safe to move outside of the component. Here we've moved the print count function outside the component and passed the count state as a parameter. This allows the function to be reused anywhere and makes it easier to manage the dependencies in the useEffect. One thing to be mindful of is in the dependency array that comparisons are done by shadow comparison. This comparison method is used for each item in the dependency array. While shadow comparison works fine for primitive values, it can lead to unexpected results when dealing with arrays, functions, and objects as dependencies. For these types, the comparison is based on the reference rather than the value itself. Example, if I create two different objects with the same data using shadow comparisons, they are not equal. Since I am comparing the reference and these two different objects, they will have two different references. To address this issue, you can utilize useCallback and use memo hooks, or implement self-checking of values. Although the details of these solutions are beyond the scope of this video, it is important to be aware of them. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was able to help you out. Please like and give me a sub. If you also have any suggestions or problems in React Native, please leave a comment and I can try to make a video about it. See you next time.